Greetings from the North Woods of Wisconsin. This is Chad Lewis, and you are listening to the Bigfoot Society podcast.
Thanks for coming back to Bigfoot Society, your weekly cryptozoology-focused podcast where I talk to a different individual in the cryptozoology field, authors, researchers, artists, all sorts of people. If you're listening to this on iTunes, please go ahead, subscribe to this podcast and rate us 5 stars, as it helps us get more into the podcast stratosphere and get better guests on the show. Also, if you're on YouTube, do us a favor, like this video and subscribe to this channel. It doesn't cost a thing, and it helps us get out there into the YouTube stratosphere as well. Be sure to leave what your favorite part of the episode was in the comment. Welcome back to another episode of the Bigfoot Society podcast. This week I talked to a new friend, Joshua Cutchin from Where the Footprints End. A very interesting and fun dialogue about a lot of topics to do with the field of Bigfooting that some people might say as being fringe topics, but it's very interesting to hear Josh's take on it and to learn something from this conversation, as we all can learn something from all of the discussions we have on Bigfoot Society. At least that's the goal. So sit back and relax. We're going to talk about orbs. We're going to talk about Bigfoot mimicking owls. It stuff that's blowing my mind, and I'm sure it's going to blow yours. So enjoy this week's episode of the podcast. And Small Town Monsters, be careful up there in Alaska. There's only one of you guys. All right. Thanks for coming back to the Bigfoot Society podcast. I've got the privilege of talking to Mr. Joshua Cutchin this week. How's it going, sir?
It's going great, and you nailed the pronunciation. So.
Oh, I did. Oh, I'm.
Oh
it
yeah.
only takes one time to mess up a pronunciation for you to like. Oh man, I'm glad I did. Ooh, yeah. So, Josh, I am psyched for this this interview. A lot of people are excited for this, actually. When I announced that you were coming on, they were like, "Oh, this is going to be good." So, let's do a quick bio to kind of let the listeners know what's going on here. So, Joshua Cutchin is an accomplished writer, most known for being involved with the 2-volume set Where the Footprints End, which is I would say, required reading if you're in the Bigfoot field. Like it's good, man. It's good. All right. He's also a composer and a tuba player based out of Atlanta, Georgia, which is really cool. You've got some great music. I listened to some earlier. It's kind of like brass band, like very cool stuff. I was digging it. He's also been on Ancient Aliens, Coast to Coast AM, all sorts of crazy stuff. So he gets around and he's got some cool stuff going on. But anything else that we want the listeners to know about you before we get going, Josh?
I've got some cool stuff going on and some not so cool stuff going on because I'm a tuba player, right? No, I mean that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
All right.
Yeah, I really enjoy being able to retreat to music whenever I get fed up with Fortiana, and vice versa. Especially like during the pandemic when live music just dropped out. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm focusing on my writing for a while, and I think it's healthy to have those two different sides of two different things to do.
I think that's that is a really good point, because if you're into Bigfoot the whole time, eventually you're gonna be like, oh, I gotta get something else. So like I'll watch like Star Wars or something and like kind of have a palate cleanser for a little bit. You gotta have something. So
yeah, you absolutely can burn out on this stuff, and I think I think there's something about this stuff that if you stare at it for too long, you kind of end up going a little bit nuts. And
a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean that in the most loving way, but sometimes you got to be like, whoa, man, put the bottle down.
So about the music, and this is kind of an off the wall question, but have you found your love for music, your love for the strange, love for Bigfoot, do those ever intersect in weird ways, or is it a thing where they're totally separate?
It's interesting. I often joke that it's kind of refreshing to be with my author friends and they think that the tuba thing is weird, and then to be with my
Mhm.
musician friends and they think that
Right.
the UFO and Bigfoot thing is weird. In terms of the way that they intersect, I keep trying to get some of my peanut butter in that jelly, and it never quite comes through on the music side. I have a couple of tunes that I've written that have some like Fortean titles,
Okay.
but not a whole lot. With one exception, I do have a piece that I wrote for Tuba Ensemble, that is about the Wild Hunt, which is the typically European folkloric idea of the spectral army that rides through the sky.
Nice.
That's published, and I wrote that. I think I actually wrote that before I was fully interested in these things. If you look back through like my history, you'll see that this thing's Fortiana and the paranormal keep on like rearing their head at points in my life. I just wasn't listening to it. Wasn't listening to that calling.
Gotcha.
Until about 7 years ago, is when I said, okay, I guess I'm going to do this. So.
There's a question that came in from the audience Instagram, and so Jordan Heath, he's from Campfire Tales of Strange and Unsettling. He asked, was there a account that made you think that Bigfoot might be something that like you read it and you were like, oh, that's cool, like something way back?
Well, so I was always a monster kid, and like Bigfoot was actually my thing.
Okay.
Which is kind of funny that this was my first like book solely dedicated to Bigfoot, because I sort of ended up jumping into the UFO stuff before I did the Bigfoot stuff. Of course, all this kind of comes together in bits and pieces. But I was kind of not sold on the whole UFO thing until I discovered, the idea that, oh, this might have something to do with altered states of consciousness, and that's what opened it up to me. But before that, prior to that, I was mostly interested in Bigfoot. And, we were just talking earlier about how, the first book that I press into someone's hands when they say that they're interested in Bigfoot is that Jeff Meldrum book. I think it's Legend Meets Science. I'm like, this is a great place to start. It's fantastic.
Exactly.
But I think because like, I always wanted, and still to a certain degree, want Bigfoot to be a flesh and blood creature. But the first thing that made me think that there might be something a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit stranger, a little bit more folkloric is I was reading J. Robert Alley's Raincoat Sasquatch, which is a great book that not enough people talk about, I don't think.
Yeah.
And in it he mentions that the Bequas, which I really should just look this up and memorize it. It's either the I think it's the Tlingit Bigfoot analog, if memory serves. And if I'm incorrect, forgive me, but it's one of the Alaskan tribes. The Bequas, if you accept food from them and eat it, you'll be trapped with the Bequas forever. And the food looks like dried salmon, but it's actually tree bark.
Oh.
And for whatever reason, I had always thought about, or had always remembered the idea that in Western European folklore, although you see it worldwide, if you went to fairyland and you took food from the fairies and you ate it, you'd be trapped there forever. And I'm like, this sounds exactly like that thing with the Bequas.
That's weird, yeah.
And you're looking at like these cultures should not have had any contamination, right? So you're really left with one of three things. Either we did have a global civilization that was transmitting these cultural ideas back and forth, or the Jungian collective unconscious is real, and these are just ideas that are floating out there that by merit of being a human being will find their way into your brain.
Wow.
or that these people are describing something objectively real, and any one of those is fascinating to me. Any one of those is miraculous. So that's what set me on the path towards my first book, which was all about that food taboo. But that was, I think that instance still sticks out to me, because that was one of those moments where I was like, there's something to this, and this particular aspect hasn't been explored. And then that was way back in 2014 is when I started working on A Trojan Feast, my first book, and and it wasn't until 2020 that Footprints came out.
Man, do you have like a let's say someone is like, where are the footprints at? How does that have to do with Bigfoot? Like, what's the elevator pitch for the two books that explain how it does like connect with Bigfoot?
But between Footprints and like Trojan Feast, or between
volume 1 and 2 of Where the Footprints.
Well, I have found for me that this is going to be the longest elevator pitch. So we're going up 30 floors, right?
Awesome.
I have found for me that the more I look into these things, one of two things happens, or two things do happen. The first is that I find that a lot of the orthodox, more popular explanations for what's going on, in terms of there actually being a genuinely anomalous answer to these questions, these mysteries, don't quite seem to fit for me and don't quite seem to resonate for me. And I think that's partially because I'm really sympathetic to a lot of skeptical arguments. Not in the sense that I think that there's nothing going on, but in the sense that, like, with Bigfoot, I do think that there's a problem that we don't have a body. Like that's a problem. And I know the common, the common counterpoint that we don't often run across mountain lion carcasses or bear carcasses, but like in the course of human history, we have,
Right.
So I'm sympathetic to a lot of those complaints, but at the same time, I've talked to too many people, having not really had a sighting myself. I've had some things that are suggestive of Bigfoot activity happen to me, but I've never had a sighting myself. But I've talked to people who have seen these things. I'm like, well, how do I reconcile this? That there isn't a lot of tangible evidence, even though Bigfoot does have the best evidence of any unexplained phenomena for its reality. I would argue that, but like we still don't have a body. But at the same time, I talk to these people, and it sounds like they really saw something. And then you throw into the mix all these anomalies that, like, the abruptly ending trackways that you find the series takes its name from, and you put those up against older folklore of things like, the Fey folk and witches and spirits and all sorts of other different things. And you're like, the same things that we see happening in Bigfoot folklore, in Bigfoot stories, even amongst people who are very dedicated flesh and blood researchers, you find those things resonating and appearing in older folklore regarding all these other things. Like, for example, the braiding of horse manes. Which I always thought was interesting. Yep. And I think there are even some people who claim to have seen Bigfoot breaking into stables and braiding horse manes. That's interesting, but I find it just as interesting that you'll find in England, if somebody had come into a stable and the horse's mane was braided overnight, they would have attributed it to fairies or witches. I'm like,
really?
So what's happening in those two instances, And even if it is something relatively mundane, like people not brushing their horses' manes when they put them in for the night, why do we jump to that? Why do we jump to our boogeyman? Right? Why do we jump to our boogeyman as an explanation?
Yeah.
And I find that just as interesting, honestly.
So I've literally put my notes off to the side of my screen, so I can't see them. And this could get wild and crazy. Why is it that the one culture, let's say Ireland, England, they're focusing on the fairies, the fae folk, but our culture, North America, we're seeing it as like Bigfoot and Sasquatch? Have you ever thought of maybe there's is there a reason for that? Or?
Well, I think there are a couple of different reasons. I mean, I think that in an alternate universe, if fairy folklore had been imported more successfully to the New World, we would still be attributing it to fairies. Outside of the East Coast, a lot of that folklore didn't really make its way into the continental United States. You find it here and there, but like mostly, especially like New England, and up into like, that the eastern coast of Canada, that's where you find a lot of that folklore about fairies persevering. So I think that's part of it. I think that something about Bigfoot, even though it can be traced back to, that wild man archetype from Europe, I think that something about it is very appealing to the sort of Western materialist, physicalist mindset. That everything that exists in reality is matter, is it's going to be it's either a flesh and blood creature or it doesn't exist, right? There's no in between. And that's something that a lot of indigenous cultures were comfortable sitting in that gray area. And for those of us who are of European settler descent who are here in the Americas, our own lineage used to be able to sit in that area a lot comfortably as well.
Mm.
And that mindset, I think that the reason that where the footprints end hasn't been more derided than it has is because I think people are coming around to that way of thinking again. Now, I'm sure that some people will think that that's some sort of, sign of the fall of civilization, that we're actually entertaining these ideas about, this in between, not physical versus physical sort of middle gray area. But at the same time, if you look at things like, psi phenomena, that's the one hill that I will die on in terms of me saying there is something to this, because a lot of the psi phenomena research by people like Dean Radin, and Daryl Bim, and even Rupert Sheldrake, has some teeth to it. Like, we're talking about laboratory experiments that are functioning at very high levels that seem to preclude random chance. So I say that to say that, like, we're kind of, as a culture, we're kind of learning that maybe our, Cartesian dualism of things being real or not real, or physical or not physical, that's kind of breaking down a little bit. And I think that's probably the reason that people are more willing to entertain the idea. I mean, quite frankly, the woo ideas that are in the book, because there's some far out ideas in Footprints 1 and 2.
I would say it's probably the best resource you can find out there for, like, getting a solid viewpoint of all those viewpoints, but also, like, solid sightings to back up different things. Like, you've really done your research for getting different Bigfoot sightings from all over the place, really, it seems.
Well, I really appreciate it. Yeah, I think, so Tim Renner, who I never want to leave out of the conversation.
Oh yeah, totally.
He's a huge part of this. It was his idea, actually. Originally sort of wanted to structure this as more of an encyclopedia of weird Bigfoot. And I came in and I kind of shifted the focus a little bit, but we kind of wound up in between. But yeah, we tried to put as many things as we can in there. The only thing that we didn't really give a lot of time or space to is ideas that Bigfoot are the Nephilim, which is just a rabbit hole that neither of us, quite frankly, felt like going down, because
that's a rabbit hole. Yeah.
It's a rabbit hole, and the people who think that are very vocal about thinking that. Not saying that that's not the case. I mean, I'm a Christian myself. Even though I'm a weirdo Christian, I'm a Christian myself. But it's just something that was just like, that's going to add another 20,000 words, I think, if you want to do it justice. So we kind of mentioned that a little bit, but really trying to look at these templates from around the world with these different traditions. And I'm sure some people will, look at the books and say, well, what is Bigfoot? And I'm like, we don't know. But we are saying that depending on what suite of attributes you're looking at in terms of paranormal phenomena or paranormal entities, there are a lot of similarities between what we attribute to Bigfoot and things, again, like fairies, like witches, like ghosts, like, all sorts of other things.
That's a lot. There was a lot there. I'm gonna have to go back and rewatch. Like, this is amazing. There's a lot. This is a rewatch one for sure. They're all rewatch ones, guys. But you know what I'm saying. Man,
well,
I love that.
I appreciate it. And if I ever go too far afield, just feel free to rein me back in.
I gotta ask you some. I'm gonna ask you some weird stuff. So eventually, a little later on, we're gonna go into maybe some different points that are brought out in the books. But I gotta ask you right off the bat, what do you feel? So about, like, Skinwalker Ranch and Sherman Ranch and stuff like that, right? You know about the story where they saw the portal open up, and they saw, like, a humanoid Bigfoot, like, I think, step out of the portal. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's,
man, Skinwalker is such a tangled mess at this point. You know what I mean?
It's interesting.
It's kind of like Roswell to me in the way that, like, I think something weird's going on there, but there are so many fingers in that pie that it's it's starting to look like we'll never have a firm idea of what's going on. And what I mean by that is there are allusions that you'll find in some of Valet's writings and some of the stuff that Erica Lukes has talked about. It sounds like that was kind of a government playground to explore non-lethal weapons testing. Like, there's some curious waivers that you'll find, I think, in some of the security guards. Yeah. So, like, and what does that mean? Because the Uinta Basin is weird, and has been weird long before there was a U.S. government at all.
Oh, totally.
So does that mean that, like, they said, okay, well, we can use this as cover to play with our toys? Does that mean that they're using the energy of the area to somehow, make these toys? I really don't know. As far as that particular anecdote about the portal, it certainly is resonant with a lot of stories that you hear about Bigfoot coming in and out of portals elsewhere. And like there's a part of me where I hear stories like I can write about Bigfoot coming in and out of a portal all day, but when somebody comes up to me and says that they saw Bigfoot step out of a portal, I still kind of go, okay, you know,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
it, even though I do think that there's something to that, it's just like I'll tell you part of what it is too.
All right.
Whenever I see somebody in the UFO field who comes to me and they have like all the answers in terms of like, and it starts to sound like Star Wars, right? Like, the Zebel Ganubians are fighting the Krasmats from Klegon 5, and it's like, okay, that's a little bit too tidy for me. I think that the phenomena is a lot messier. So when people say that they saw Bigfoot step out of a portal, sometimes I don't know what to do with that. But at the same time, it would be a handy explanation for a lot of different things. And if you want to wrap that up in a sort of quasi-scientific bow and say that these are other dimensions, that's fine. I tend to be more of a spiritually inclined person, so I think that you say another dimension, you might as well be saying the other world, whatever that was, fairyland, dreamland, the afterlife,
alternate universe, something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah. So, yeah. I still don't know what to make of that story from Skinwalker, because it sounds like a Bigfoot crawling through, and I would have absolutely crapped my pants if I'd seen
crazy.
that.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
I really hope someday, because it seems like that's kind of a one-off thing, and there's been no more like Bigfoot stuff in that area that at least that they've talked about. So maybe someday. But you seem to be always, you're probably already researching. Looking into Bigfoot reports. These books have been out for a few years. Have there been reports that you've seen since they've come out that are like, you're just like, wow, that is just like a fantastic report or story, but it's not in the book?
Yeah, there have been a couple of times when I see something, I'm like, man, I really wish we had known about that. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if I can remember any.
Okay.
But anything that really mixes different things up. I mean, part of it too is the fact that like you kind of know if you've hit a nerve when you see new cases, and you can kind of imagine where they would fit in a story. As far as something that I've heard since then, I know that I've heard a couple ones, and I can't remember what they are. A lot of what I think is really interesting is to see the sort of feedback that we've gotten.
Oh, sure.
From people who have taken certain ideas and really run with them, and I'm like, oh, duh, of course, So one of them was, this idea that Tim put together, which I told him at the time. I said, "There's nothing to this. I don't know why you're exploring this. This idea of women in white and wild men, and how that idea stretches back over the years, and." Up to and including sightings of these spectral women in white who have been seen at Bigfoot habituation sites. Now, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that they're connected, but it's rare enough to see a ghost. It's rare enough to see a Bigfoot. What are the odds of you seeing them both on your property and them not being related somehow, right? But that is actually a deep connection that stretches back into just some of the earliest folklore, and time and again you find this where, like, a wild man character is paired with a a virginal maiden character or something like that, as these two sort of partners in crime, as you were. And people, some of the people who've read the book have taken this a step further, and they've said, have you ever thought about how the Christmas tree is kind of like a microcosm of where the footprints in? And I'm like, what? They're like, you've got the Christmas lights, which are like the anomalous lights that are seen in areas of heavy Bigfoot activity. Okay. You've got the Santa Claus, who is a wild man. Like, you can literally trace that. You can literally trace that lineage through Odin to the Wadwos to European wildman archetype. And you have the angel on top of the tree as the woman in white. I'm like, that kind of makes sense. But then once you see that, once that unlocks with you the idea of the woman in white and the Bigfoot, that dichotomy of the feminine and the the pure feminine and the feralized masculine. You see it everywhere. Beauty and the
Hmm.
Beast and King Kong, and you end up seeing that everywhere. And it's
Oh
interesting to
yeah.
me that
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. I can see
yeah,
that. Yeah. I'm gonna probably see that everywhere now. That's really weird.
yeah. That's the way it works.
Yeah. It's like you buy a Volvo and everyone is driving Volvos around you. It's just
Yep.
what you're looking for, right? Why do you think it's in? Let's talk about Bigfoot research for a little bit. Why do you think it's important to not just maybe get stuck on a way of thinking that might be like, okay, it's only this and I can't consider other things? Why is it so important to consider like all the things?
Well, I mean, so I can take this in a couple different directions.
Okay.
For me, like, I don't like to stick with one idea or to just have my mind made up going in on something. I like to challenge my own held beliefs politically, religiously, like all those beliefs. I like to challenge them because I think that strengthens them. And the other thing is, being sort of a John Keel disciple. Keel famously said, "Belief is the enemy," because if your thinking gets calcified, it gets brittle, and you can't pivot as easily, and it's easy for something to shatter your worldview. But there's some other stuff that bothers me about people who are really, really adherent and insist that Bigfoot is a flesh and blood creature. I am saying that maybe it is and maybe it isn't.
Okay.
I really don't know, and there's obviously a very strong physical component to this, but first of all, you'll talk to these people who are like, well, if somebody says that the Bigfoot vanished before their eyes, maybe it just jumped behind a tree or jumped into a ditch. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But if you want to walk that logic back, you can arrive at, oh, the person saw a bear. You know what I mean? So why are we even doing this?
Right.
Well, if it jumped into, well, maybe you saw a bear. And then, there's this other idea that we have a lot of indigenous testimony from a bunch of different tribes. They all believe different things, but you can kind of lump them into three categories, which is Bigfoot is an animal, Bigfoot is an animal with supernatural qualities, or Bigfoot is supernatural, right?
Sure.
And, there's almost this holdover of, not to use these sort of buzzwords that people are talking about, but there's this kind of colonialist dismissive undercurrent to a lot of cryptozoology, where they're by Jove, these primitive savages say that the creature can vanish at will. They must be mistaken. It's quite a stealthy creature. And I'm like, look, these are people who have lived in the wilderness since time immemorial. They know when an owl's an owl, and they know when something's a little bit different. So I think that kind of plays into it a little bit. But I feel like there's not enough agnosticism regarding exactly what these things are. And by these things, I mean UFOs, lake monsters, Bigfoot, other cryptids, because the jury's still out, because no one does have one in their garage. So you can say things like, well, this doesn't seem to be something that you see in a lot of cases, or this does seem to be something that you see in a lot of cases. You can talk about dermal ridges and mid-tarsal breaks all day. I'm on board for that, But when you just say outright that hypothesis A, B, or C is not possible, or even worse, that people who entertain those ideas are lazy thinkers, that's when I get a problem with it. Because there's plenty of lazy thinking on both sides when it comes to the flesh and blood versus not flesh and blood issue, in my opinion. Gotcha. Plenty of New Age people who are talking about Bigfoot, the forest spirit who's here to save humanity.
Right.
It's all, yeah. Anyway, and what I like to do is try to find that sort of middle ground where it's like, well, is there a way that it seems like we can have our cake and eat it too?
I like that. Yeah, it's on this podcast, I am I guess you could use the terminology flesh and blood guy, but I like to have varying differing viewpoints on the show, and then learn a little bit from everyone, which I think is important for us all to do.
Right. And I guess it just comes from this place of I feel like, and this is maybe a harsh characterization, but I feel like the flesh and blood community derides the people who don't think Bigfoot is a flesh and blood creature more than vice versa. Because everybody that I've talked to is just like, hey, let's look at these odd outliers over here rather than just ignore them outright, which it seems like a lot of people in the flesh and blood community are very content to do.
Mm.
And if you believe a witness when they say Bigfoot crossed the road, and you're like taking notes furiously, and then they say it disappeared into a ball of light, and you're like, oh, I don't
Yeah, rip it up. I don't know.
Yeah. It's just like, well, I mean, did this person seem credible to you 30 seconds ago? Like,
Right.
Yeah. So I think we could all be more give each other a little bit more grace than we do. Honestly.
I think that's one of those solid lessons to take away as being a good human being that could apply to a lot of different things. So definitely good words there. Let's go through maybe a few different points I wrote down as I was looking through your books there. And I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on the different subjects. So, and I've had a story, this particular subject. I had a gentleman tell me a story once where he saw a Bigfoot coming down a trail. Actually, sorry, he saw an orb first, and then he looked further down the trail and he saw like a Bigfoot controlling it with like one of his hands or something like that, which is kind of a cool, idea. But
yeah, I
like,
love it.
What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on like the orbs being seen around the Bigfoot?
Well, I mean, so you're trying to cobble together some sort of explanation from all this, quite frankly, nonsense, right? These things that don't
Sure.
that don't compute, right?
Yeah.
I have a couple of different thoughts about that. I think sometimes that now, of course, in the specific example of the Bigfoot controlling the orb, was there like a device or something, or?
No, he was just like the way I imagine it.
Doctor Stranging it?
No. Even better in Labyrinth when David Bowie is like this.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like
that's
that kind
great.
of.
I love that.
But Doctor Strange is great too.
So I have thought sometimes because like the light phenomena is something that you see everywhere. Like I don't think that there is a single. I'm sure somebody can prove me wrong, but to my knowledge, there's not a single paranormal phenomena that doesn't involve light phenomena. And orbs, I think you could say even more specifically. And so much of that is context dependent, right? Like you see an orb in the sky, it's a UFO. You see it, bobbing along you see it bobbing along Stonehenge and it's a fairy light, or you see it in a haunted house and it's a ghost. And, you see it in the woods and it's a ghost light, but then you have the Bigfoot thrown in there to sort of,
Right.
Undermine your expectations. But to that extent, I kind of wonder if like the lights are not like the naked, unvarnished version of the phenomena, if there is a shared paranormal supernatural phenomena, if that's like you ever played a video game and this happened on computers in like in the 90s and early 2000s a lot, where like a file would be corrupted and like the texture would be missing,
Oh yeah, totally.
Sometimes I kind of wonder if that's not what we're seeing with the lights, right? Like it's unskinned.
That's really scary actually to think about.
It's unskinned, right? And then
Right.
and then in my again, this is all super speculative and super hypothetical, but we do know that there's a connection between the release of between the pineal gland and melatonin, which is DMT, and we all know that the pineal gland was an eye at one point, and it's triggered by light still, and it functions and it's related to melatonin production. Anyway, so if we all contain this very potent psychedelic in our systems, which is dimethyltryptamine, which we all do, everyone listening, congratulations, you're holding now. Does this light somehow interact with that and dump that DMT into our system, and then we, or the phenomena itself, if there is an intelligence behind it, and I do think there is, sort of goes through the wardrobe of our brain and says, oh, this person is kind of interested in Bigfoot, let's wear the Bigfoot outfit, or oh, this person is,
I've heard before, that it's using what we have in our minds and then kind of making it so that we don't freak out.
Yeah, so I mean that's maybe something.
Yeah, maybe.
But when you've got this sort of hierarchy in like the story that you were talking about, where like the Bigfoot is controlling the orb, part of me doesn't know what to do with that. And it's not an uncommon thing where you hear about Bigfoot holding orbs. There was a couple of cases in the 70s, I think not necessarily part of that Stan Gordon wave, but I think just in other parts of this. I think this is maybe near Pittsburgh or something, where somebody saw a Bigfoot holding an orb and like there was a flying saucer in the distance, above them.
Wow.
The trifecta, right?
Yeah.
And I think that there is a very important thread to pull on regarding the way that we conceptualize the human soul. And I'm being sort of coy and cagey about that because it's part of my new book that's not out. And it's not like I'm trying to gin up publicity or anything for that. It's just such a complex thing that I don't really want to get into it. But like, we've oftentimes thought that these anomalous ghost lights were human souls, our own souls wandering, death omens, all sorts of different things. So once you introduce that factor into a Bigfoot sighting, you have to sort of look at like, well, maybe Bigfoot has something to do with death and the nature of our souls, which,
wow,
it's weird.
Yeah, that is weird.
But if you want to sort of follow that trackway, it'll take you to some odd places. And so people, I'm sure, are going to be like, oh, well, it must be demons. I'm like, well, it's not quite what I'm saying either. I think that there's, a robust ecosystem of weird things out there that are preoccupied with things on that side of the curtain, if that makes any sense.
I think it does. And that's it, the whole, like, there's the Brown Mountain lights, there's the orb lights seen around Pukwudgie reports. I mean, it really does, like, there's so many different ways the orb thing goes. But there's
also dust. Every Ghost Hunter episode, like, there's we caught an orb, but it's so there's also dust and there's also bugs.
Yeah, there totally is.
Not what we're talking about, folks. We're talking about
we'll get the Ghost Adventures audience will be up in arms about that.
Zach Baggins coming at you,
dude. I would love to interview Zach Baggins. That would be so
intense. It'll be fun.
I would love it. Dude, Zach, I know you're listening to this every week. Come on, man. I found it interesting in your books. I can't remember which one. I'm sorry, but the part about owls. So it's like a lot. There's a lot of people that are thinking that when they hear an owl, it's actually a Bigfoot performing the noise. Is that or something of that nature?
Yeah, owls are a strange. Pardon the pun. Owls are a strange bird. Literally and figuratively. So my good friend Mike Cleland has sort of looked into the UFO owl connection at length, and that's a huge topic. But along with that, you do start to get these stories of owls and UFOs being seen either together or in close proximity, or like people seeing these gigantic owls. And you also get stories. There's one story, I think, in volume 2, where there's this woman who went to her sweat lodge and she saw some Bigfoot outside, and there were owls around her home at the time, and it ended with her having a giant triangular UFO sighting as it floated overhead while her husband battled poltergeists inside his house.
What? No.
I don't know but here's the thing, man. So I hear stories that wild, and I'm like, if I was going to make up a story that someone would buy, it wouldn't be that. It would be like,
I wouldn't go that far. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm a big fan of just high strangeness in general. But returning to the owl, there does seem to be some sort of connective tissue there, and people do oftentimes report Bigfoot mimicking all sorts of things, from human beings to other animals to especially lots of different bird calls, right? And owls are an especially common one. Lots of times they'll say it sounded like an owl, but it sounded like a 500-pound owl, And what's interesting to me is that, and people who are on the more of the flesh and blood side of things will find this interesting too, is that, so we've all heard of these. We oftentimes don't know what to call them when we hear them in pop culture, but they're called contact calls, which is, where you have special ops guys going, they're communicating.
Right. Yeah.
But there's an entire field of study that has cataloged the most often used contact calls that people use for stealth operations. And at one point it was very common, I think, in Europe for for thieves to use owl sounds.
Oh, weird.
Because there was, not only would people expect to hear an owl at night, right? But also there were so many superstitions surrounding owls that like people would generally kind of stay away because they were oftentimes an omen of death again. So you have that in there as well. It kind of sounds to me like maybe there might be some sort of connection there. But returning to this mimicry idea, some of the ways that Bigfoot can mimic things sounds like it's pretty uncanny. And it sounds like we're talking about like a lyrebird level of mimicry that's going on here, because like it sounded, there's one story, it's like, I was 40 miles from anywhere and I heard a forklift backing up, or, Ron Moorhead.
Yes.
Yeah. The stampeding horses by the Sierra site.
Or the car door closing in the woods where there's
car
no
door closing,
cars.
yeah.
That's all the time I hear that. Yeah.
So, it's possible for an animal to make those noises, because like if you haven't looked up a lyrebird, like go do that. It's crazy.
Wild. It's wild.
Yeah, it's wild. But there's no mammalian precedent for that. I think it was Moorhead who suggested that maybe Bigfoot have dual sets of vocal cords, and the only mammal that does is a marsupial. It's a quality.
Oh, interesting.
So you start and you see this again with Bigfoot. It's like, well, Bigfoot could have this attribute. And it's like, cool. And you're like, well, they could also be like the only creature on Earth with glowing eyes. And you're like, oh, okay, that too. So two very unique things. And they're like, and they can leap, 100 feet. And like, wait, okay, so like the two animals that can leap the farthest are the snow leopard and the cliff springer, and that's 50 feet. So you're telling me like it's like at the top of its game in like 8 different ways in the animal kingdom. It kind of makes me wonder if that's a bit of a misinterpretation sometimes. But interestingly, if you look at, one of the most common things that people get in terms of these sounds of hearing Bigfoot are these, bird calls or bird calls especially. And they're always like, it sounds like a bird, but it's kind of off. It's a little bit too deep. It's a little bit this or that. But like, I would say far and away bird calls are what you hear from Bigfoot most often. And, there are a couple of different directions you can go with that. I mean, like it's a very common esoteric concept amongst magical practitioners that like birdsong encodes special wisdom from the heavens. The language of birds. You find that as an esoteric concept. And then also, if you look to medieval art, you'll find that that apes and birds oftentimes had an antagonistic relationship. Like you have like an ape reaching for a bird, or an ape, trying to attack a bird. And that implies sort of a relationship there, especially when you look at examples of, I think it's the Ngoi Rung, I think, if memory serves, the Vietnamese rock apes. I think that's right.
Yeah, sure.
Who are reported like, attacking birds with stones and stuff. So it's almost like life is imitating art to be kind of woo about it.
That is weird, but a very cool explanation. You've mentioned his name earlier, Stan Gordon. What are your thoughts about? So let's say Chestnut Ridge, and you've got all these reports of like there's a Bigfoot sighting, but it's next to a UFO sighting. How does one wrap their mind around that?
So I think it was there's a great book that's out there. Have you read Ann Slayton Alberry's Bigfoot book?
It's on the list. I have
if
not
you can
yet.
Get your hands on it, it's wild. And John Green, to his credit, wrote the foreword. But I think in it he says, well, if there is a connection there, I would assume that the flying saucer people are studying the Bigfoot. And it's like, okay, so like good on you, John, that you wrote that forward. But like that's levels of assumption in anthropomorphism.
Oh, big time.
Anthropomorphization of whatever lies behind the UFOs that I can't quite buy into. And Tim, my co-author, said 2 things to me that I thought were really prescient. And number one was, okay, well, if UFOs are interested in primates, why don't we get more, orangutan UFO sightings or gorilla UFO sightings?
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, maybe Bigfoot's an interesting outlier, and that's why they're investigating them. But then you look at something else that Tim said, which I sort of alluded to earlier regarding the ghost thing, is it is very rare to see a Bigfoot. It is very rare to see a UFO. It is orders of magnitude rarer
Yeah.
to see them both, right? So what are the
Totally.
odds? So what are the odds that these things aren't connected? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, I would say probably at this point antagonistic to the extraterrestrial hypothesis as well.
Fair enough.
But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have an answer on why we see UFOs and Bigfoot. And again, some of these stories are just, knuckin' futs. I think there's a story in the book about the woman who was taken aboard a UFO and saw a Bigfoot reading a newspaper, and that may be, that may be National Enquirer level stuff,
right?
But at the same time, it's so strange that it kind of makes me say, is somebody lapsing into an altered state of consciousness or something? And that's an area that cryptozoologists, I think, haven't explored quite enough, is that idea that somehow altered states of consciousness might be playing a role in these things too.
Ooh, that's an interesting thought. Definitely. Yeah.
The UFO community is quite on board with the idea nowadays. But if and to be fair, a lot of Bigfoot reports don't have those same hallmarks that you see in psychedelic trips and near-death experiences, and you don't quite get all those things. You get some of them here and there, but you don't quite get all those things. But I still think it would be an interesting direction to look in, especially for the weirder reports. Are people slipping into some sort of again, are they mentally slipping into another dimension, or are they entering the realm of pure imagination because of some sort of external stimuli? Maybe,
there's a lot of areas you could go with that, but yeah, if you could monitor brain waves or something, I don't know. But try to put a few more questions in, because man, we're 45 minutes in. This is going fast and furious. I love it. What would you say to the listener that's saying, I don't have anything weird in my area?
Well, I would say that just in terms of super weird Bigfoot, or just
anything, like I live in middle of Iowa. There's nothing weird here.
I feel this way sometimes because I feel like I'm paranormal kryptonite. I've had some pretty dramatic ghost stuff happen to me, but it's not often. I talked to some of my friends who claim to have had a lot of stuff happen. I'm like, man, what is your life like? There's an interesting conversation that happened. I believe it was on my friend Greg Bishop's show, Radio Mysterioso, back when that Skinwalker Ranch documentary was released. And he was talking to Knapp and Corbell.
Yeah.
And
I would love to talk to Knapp. Oh my goodness.
I think it came up. Well, that was more for Corbell than it was for.
No, I get it. I get it.
But I think it came up that why is Skinwalker Ranch so strange? And I think the assertion or the conclusion that they reached was that Skinwalker Ranch isn't any different than your backyard. It's just that it happens more often there. And that there might be dozens or hundreds of places everywhere, but often honestly, if you look, I would say that you are no more than a few hours drive from something strange, and I would say a good place to start looking would be wilderness areas, a lot of ancient archaeological sites. I think there's something to Keel's window area idea being centered around those. Exactly what that means, I don't know, but I think that you see that sort of trend happening from time to time again. But there is weirdness to be found. And if you're really adventurous, you can bring the weirdness to you, which Terrence McKenna style, 5 dried grams in silent darkness. But I'm not advocating for that. But I know some people.
I don't get the reference, but I sure don't advocate whatever it is.
Yeah. No, I mean it's this idea that if you are looking to. I'm not a magical practitioner. I have never done psychedelic drugs. And that's not me being being a little church boy or something. I really haven't, because they terrify the hell out of me. But there are, I remember talking to my friends and I'm like, man, it would really be kind of cool to see one of the fae folk. And he's like, well, if you get some mushrooms, I'm sure we can make that happen. So I mean, you can go looking for it, or sometimes if you look hard enough, it'll come your way, even without any of those things going on.
So speaking of looking for it, let's say you've got a listener where they're like, "Oh, I've read Josh and Josh's books, and they're awesome, and I love all the stories." How can I find my own stories? Like, where is he finding all these stories from? Like,
Oh man, partially from being just obsessive. A
okay, yeah,
really good place. I mean, like, so we were talking about this before we started.
right,
I do listen to a lot of podcasts.
okay,
In part, I started that when I was on my commute, but it's kind of the thing right now. Whereas if I'm not doing something that needs my oral attention, or I'm not trying to
mm-hmm.
write, I've got a podcast going. And you'll find stories in there. And if you're looking for a specific idea or something like that, you'll find a story that will allow you to pull on a thread. And from there, it's just like serendipity.
Mm.
You end up pulling on that thread and it leads you in another direction. It leads you to somebody or something that you've never heard about. And that's been always a really good avenue for me. I mean, part of what I do is I have a lot of digitized magazines.
Oh, nice.
And I have a pretty extensive library, so that helps, right? That
Yeah, it
helps.
does. Yep.
But yeah, I think if you're just looking for stories, that's a good place to start. And I don't know if they are any more valid, but I do have a soft spot for those pre-internet magazine stories and journal stories, because it took a little bit more
Yeah.
effort. It took a little bit more effort to get that to get that printed than it does to hop on Reddit and say, I was attacked by Dogman in Yosemite or something.
I love the 1960s Bigfoot journals.
Mhm.
And it's like Renee DeHinden writes in and says, "I'm out to look for the Bigfoot," and then John Green is hanging out too, and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, this is awesome!" You can
Yeah.
find those. You have to know where to look, but they are digitized and out there.
Yeah, and you know what? I find a lot of people don't know how powerful Google Advanced Search can be. Um,
Exactly.
so if you just like I'm sure there's some YouTube videos. Okay, there are YouTube videos for everything, but like, yeah, just look into that, and like that can lead you some really cool places as well. And then the other thing is, sounds so dorky, your local library, but but interlibrary loan is a beautiful thing.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
It got sort of sidetracked over COVID. They weren't doing that as much, but
Hmm.
and if you are close to a university, especially a flagship university like a state, the
Yep.
University of XYZ, those libraries, oftentimes you can't check anything out, but you can walk in and just walk through the stacks. And sometimes if you find a topic, a book on a topic, there'll be a lot of books around it and you're like, oh, that looks interesting too. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've like
And
incredible threads to pull on from the book beside the book I was looking for.
And if you live near Humboldt State University in California, they have a whole Bigfoot reference room. I believe that's the
That's
name of the
amazing.
school, because Bobo always talks about it on Bigfoot and Beyond. But let's end with one final question. And uh, what are what are 3 books that you could recommend to listeners?
I'm going to recommend 5.
Oh, perfect! I love
I'm
it.
going to
Even
recommend
better.
5 because we've already talked about Meldrum's book. We've already
Yep.
talked about J. Robert Alley's book, so those aren't going to count. So
Okay. Cool.
3 ones that I would recommend on top. Bigfoot specific or not?
Uh, Bigfoot cryptozoology. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Um. So, I would have said, um, George P. Hansen's The Trickster and the Paranormal, but he doesn't really get into cryptozoology too much, so I'll throw that out. Patrick Harper's Demonic Reality
Okay.
is a wonderful book, and it will sort of open you up to this way of thinking, whether you like it or not. It's a beautifully written book, and whether or not you agree with it, he makes an interesting case for the sort of ephemeral nature of some cryptids.
Oh, interesting.
I am absolutely look back here on my my shelf. Another Bigfoot book that I really love is The Locals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that Tom Powell?
Tom Powell, yeah.
Yes.
Tom
Yep.
Powell's The Locals
Yep.
is another great one.
Yep.
And I would also recommend, I'm trying to think specifically, Bigfoot. I think I'm gonna sort of sidestep the cryptozoology specific thing,
Sure.
and I'm gonna say Jerome Clark's The Unexplained.
Oh, a classic.
I grew up with that book, and
Yep.
that original copy is still at my parents' place, and it's like
Wow.
it's got like masking tape around it because the
Yeah.
cover fell off.
Oh man.
But like I find it so, I think diversity is important, not only in the way that we're talking about it nowadays, but like just diversity of opinion and diversity of thought and diversity of
Sure.
topics. Like the healthiest
I agree.
ecosystems are diverse ecosystems, right? And your
Mhm.
brain is no different. And I think that really cultivating a healthy interest in a lot of these different topics can allow you to start to see some of the connections. And I'm convinced that if we ever get to the bottom of these topics, which I don't think we will, but I'm convinced that the answer very well might reside in some of these things that no one has ever even thought of connecting to it, or not even thought of looking at.
Gotcha.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh man, those are solid recommendations that have never been brought up on the show. So thank you for
Awesome.
that. Audience will be pumped to hear new ones that are not cryptozoology A to Z and Sasquatch legend meets science. Not to
Yeah.
belittle those because they need to be
Right.
on your bookshelf. But before we head on out of the main show, Josh, do you mind sharing where people can keep up to date with what's going on and anything you want to plug about upcoming stuff? The floor is yours to do it whatever you want.
Okay, well, here we go.
Okay.
Everything about me you can find at joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN, just like a cut on your chin, .com. That's got updates for all my upcoming books. I have 3 books that should be coming out relatively soon. One is a book of essays that I edited and contributed to on how fairy folklore finds its way into films. And the other 2 are a 2-parter that I'm releasing all about death and the paranormal and how a lot of these different things seem to overlap with those.
Wowzers.
Festivals are back, baby.
They're back, baby. Yep.
Back, baby. Next weekend, so not this upcoming weekend, not 2 days from now, but a week from 2 days from now, I'll be at the Western North Carolina Bigfoot Festival in Marion. I'm not speaking or anything, but I'll have a table, so come by and say hi.
And be nice.
And be nice. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then August is an absolute mess for me.
Really?
Yeah, in a good way. I will be speaking at the Worldwide Metaphysical Tribe in Illinois.
Wow.
Yeah, that's August 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th. It's sort of a retreat, and they have some people. I think I might be one of the first cryptid speakers there.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because Worldwide Metaphysical Tribe, we're not talking about flesh and blooders here.
Right. Yeah, not at all. Yeah.
And then the following weekend, I am pleased to announce that I will be a speaker at the Midwest Conference on the Unknown.
Where's that?
That's in Cape Girardeau, Missouri.
Wow. I'm from Central Iowa, so that's very interesting. Very cool.
Yeah, that's August 5th through 7th, and they've really put together a rogues gallery of speakers. It's myself.
Wow.
It's myself, right? No, it's myself, Micah Hanks, Ryan Sprague, Joel Rhodes, Zach Bales, Margie Kay, Michael Huntington. Yeah, and I think some other folks that haven't.
That's a solid conference for Missouri. My goodness.
It's going to be a good hang. Yeah. So
wow.
Excited about that.
Okay. Very cool to see Ryan Sprague out here. And all those guys. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Good for you guys. Good for you.
It's going to be fun.
Wow. Josh, it has been super fun to have you on. You're going to hang out a little bit more for the Patreon after show. So patreon.com/Bigfoot Society. If you want to hear that, we're going to be talking. I got topics down here. We'll talk about fairies. We'll talk about the Goblin universe. We'll talk about UFOs and aliens. We'll talk about other stuff. It's going to be wild. And we might have some people with questions. We'll see. But Josh, thank you so much for coming on tonight.
An absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Bigfoot Society podcast. Please take a few minutes to review the show on iTunes, 5 stars, as it does help us get into the eyes and ears of more listeners on iTunes. That will help us just get bigger and bigger and get even better quality guests for future shows. Also, if you have any Bigfoot encounters or cryptid encounters, please send your stories and audio and photos, whatever you've got, over to BigfootSociety@gmail.com. If you'd like to become more involved with Bigfoot Society and get some extra content, we do have a Patreon where you can get all sorts of cool things. For example, for $7 a month, you get extra Bigfoot Society content, usually interviews, but other things as well. You get a sweet membership card and a vinyl sticker that I send to you in the mail. You get access to the Bigfoot Society after show, which is an extra interview after the main interview with the weekly guest, and usually they are up for Patreon members to be in that extra show segment with them and me, and you get to ask your question live to them and get an answer from the guest, which, as you've seen what guest we've had in the past, this could be a really big deal. There's also a private Discord where you can get involved with talking to me one-on-one and the community there, and that's always a great time. You can find the Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Bigfoot Society. We're very thankful for all our supporters that we have in so many different ways, and appreciate all our listeners coming back week after week to listen to more cryptozoology-based interviews. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. The views and opinions expressed are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Bigfoot Society. Any content provided by our guests are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone. Thank you.